I'm a Canadian born in Montreal. My parents were immigrant Roma from Europe. I grew up mainly in Montreal, but I did spend my childhood years in the United Kingdom. We were stuck there because of the war, and I couldn't get back here until after the war. And since then, I lived in Montreal. I moved to Toronto in 1997 and then to Hamilton in 2003, where we are now living. My wife and I are living at present. I am basically semi-retired journalist, a published author, educator, mainly lecturing, and I did teach a course at the New College, University of Toronto for 6 years, entitled The Romani Diaspora in Canada, the only course of its kind ever offered anywhere in Canada. And now I'm a founding member of the Roma Community Centre in Toronto in 1998, and I'm currently an honorary chairman of the Roma Community Centre. I also play Roma music, and I am a model building engineer, although I don't do that anymore because of my eyesight.
Languages do you speak and write?
Apart from English, I speak Romanes, the Vlach Romani dialect of Romanes, Spanish, and conversational French, which I learned in Montreal.
And how did you learn all of your languages? Were they at home?
Basically, partly from speaking with native speakers, and partly from books. I have that kind of ability to break a language down into its elements, which is one way of learning a language, rather than just parroting what you hear from native speakers. I think both are good, but if you can combine the two of them, and you can figure out what is a verb and how is it conjugated in a particular language, and all of the grammatical mechanisms that you use to put the language together. I used this to create my Learn Romani course, an 18-lesson course, which was published by University of Hertfordshire Press in 2005.
And how did you learn Romani? Or Romanesque, as you...
Originally, when I returned from England as a teenager, I began hanging around with my peers in Montreal, and I was learning from them. Plus, I was working in the evenings and the weekends with their fathers in the kind of work that Roma did at that period in Montreal, which was repairing stove kitchens. And then for a few years, either full-time or part-time, I worked with immigrant Roma coppersmiths, actually metalsmiths, and we traveled around Quebec doing what is called wipe tinning. That's the plating of cauldrons that are used in bakeries to make bread and cakes and other confectionaries, and also servicing restaurant kitchens. This is all described in my novel, originally called The Goddamn Gypsy, which is now out of print, but reprinted as The Living Fire by Magoria Books. It's on Amazon. This is more or less, it's not an autobiography, but it's a novel based on this period, which explains how we did all of this. My partner and I traveling around Quebec, doing this wipe tinning and restaurant, the servicing of restaurant kitchens.
What languages do you usually or generally translate or interpret?
I only translate Romanes, And how I got into this initially was being a founder of the Roma Community Center. I was working with certain lawyers in Quebec translating Roma clients. This is how it began. And also in our office, translating for Roma clients. And gradually I ended up, I'm an official Romani translator for the Immigration and Refugee Board, and interpreter, that is. This is verbal interpretation. And I'm also a translator of written material, both from English into Romani or from Romani into English. And I've had quite a bit of experience in the last few years doing written translation, which I now have a whole lot of addenda to put into my bi-directional Romani dictionary, which is scheduled to be published later this year by Megoria Books.
Is your local community here multilingual? Do they speak various dialects?
The Roma refugees that are arriving in Canada speak various dialects of Romani. Naturally, some don't speak it at all. For instance, the Romungari from Hungary have mostly lost the Romani language except for a few words. And others, for instance, Roma from Kosovo, they speak a differing dialect which can be understood to a point, especially when you're talking about conversational stuff. There's a difference whether you're translating written Romani, where you need a lot of neologisms, and spoken Romani, where even if you don't have the word, you can put it into an explanation of what the word means. For instance, we really have no word for something like existing in Romani for a refugee claim. Like we didn't even have a word for a refugee until recently. But what happens is educated Roma start using this, start writing it in emails, then it begins to be used in reports and in international meetings in Europe, and finally it seeps down to a large number of Roma, who, especially those who are on the internet. So since we have a word for asylum in Romani, which is asilo, so refugee has become asilanto in the masculine form, and asilintutsa in the feminine form. So we now have a word for refugee. Now, if we want to make the word for claim, the best way to do it is to use the Romani word mangimos or mangipe, which means a demand or a request. So
Very
you combine those two words together and you come up with a refugee claim. The problem is that the average speaker may not be aware of any of these words. So now you have to explain in a sentence. And a lot of Roma, of my colleagues who are also interpreters, are claiming they have to get, after they've done this for a few hours, they end up with a headache. I don't necessarily end up with a headache, but it is a problem, which there is a vast difference between translating written Romani and interpreting verbal Romani. A lot of people who are quite capable of being verbal interpreters are utterly incapable of doing anything written. First of all is the alphabet problem. European Roma who come here are used to trying to write Romani with European systems using diacritical marks like hat checks, which it cannot be done with the average Canadian computer without having special fonts. And even if you do have that, it slows everything down having to use hat checks. The other thing is that European systems often use the C, letter C, for what I use as a TS. For instance, cigara, meaning cigarette. Not C, IG, I use TSIG, because C to a Canadian, an English speaker, a French speaker, or a Spanish speaker in the Americas would be mispronounced. The same thing is true of the European J. J is used in Europe for what we use in English as a Y.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how many French, English, or Spanish speaking Roma would recognize that J is pronounced as a Y?
Yeah. Okay.
So I've modified the European alphabet to make it more understandable for speakers of English, French, and Spanish.
Translators usually acquire expertise in other areas of specialization in addition to their linguistic skills. Either they study or they work professionally in other areas, and then they apply their knowledge to translation, or they do it vice versa. What areas did you gain specific subject expertise?
Well, basically, apart from being a researcher, like I'm a very avid collector. As a builder of historical ships, which was one of the first things I did as a career, working for the Montreal Military and Maritime Museum, and then later on as more of a hobby that I could earn a little bit of money with by selling my models or working on contract. I began collecting all of the information I could find on historical ships and putting it into categories, classifying it, sections, rigging, parts of rigging, masting, all of this stuff. And I did the same thing with Romany. I started collecting words, and then as I went on, I began studying works of other people. Now, it's a very valuable work has been done on Romany studies from John Sampson, the Welsh Romany dialect, up through to the modern period of Yaron Matras and people like this, Marcel Cortiadi. So as far as academics writing for other academics, the material is very valuable, but it's utterly useless when it comes to translating Romany for the average Romany speaker. But it's a very valuable material. For instance, Romlex from Kunstergad, which you can get on the internet, is very useful. But my expertise came mainly, or you might say my training, from working with lawyers in Toronto, interviewing Roma clients who couldn't speak English, and who did speak Romany, at least a dialect that I could speak with them. And this was very valuable in learning the kind of terminology that I would later need to become a translator for the Immigration and Refugee Board. You see, when you translate for Romany, you sort of have to be a juggler. Like if you know your speaker is from Hungary, then you know you've already become used to the fact certain idiosyncrasies in Hungarian Vlach Romany, in pronunciation and in vocabulary, that would make it different from Romanian Romany, for example. For instance, I found a lot of European Roma using Autobanda for the highway, which obviously comes from German, Autobahn. Now, this would be unknown to Roma in North America. They would probably say Grom for road. That's the only word they would have. Now, Europeans would have the word Grom, but that would be used more for a road in a town. Then there's also the word Ulica, which is a street. And now, Canadian Roma, for instance, have no word for sidewalk. But there is one in Romanian Roma, Trotuari, which obviously, if you speak French, you know where that comes from. So this is the kind of thing that I'm getting at. You have to know something of differing dialects. Now, a good source for this is Dr. Ian Hancock's Vlach Romani grammar, which breaks the language down and treats Vlach Romani as a large number of closely related dialects. You see, the problem with something like Romlex, for instance, they have their dialects neatly classified as Calderash, Lovari, and whatever. But within Calderash itself, there are many sub-dialects, differing dialects. For instance, if I was to want to say, I sell flowers, now I would say Bikinav Lulugya, but a French Roma, French Calderash would say Bichinav Lulugya. Now, if you know these things, then you know what you can tell right away from your speaker which dialect he's speaking. Another speaker from a differing dialect might say Bitsinav Lulugya, which is again different.
Yeah.
Some speakers say Cherav instead of Karav, for I do or I make. Gurbeti, which is very close, it is a Vlach dialect, and I'm capable of corresponding with a Gurbeti speaker in email, but I do have trouble verbally understanding the dialect verbally, because the pronunciation is quite different.
This is fascinating. How would you recommend then if a young person wanted to begin to train for translation into
I would
Romani?
say to learn one dialect to begin with, get that one dialect understood, and beware of pitfalls. For instance, Romlex, to somebody who knows what they're doing, a native speaker or a fluent speaker familiar with many dialects of the same, in other words, many Calderash variants, will recognize that if they're looking for a word on Romlex, if they are using what we call the Kya dialect instead of the Cha dialect, you can't mix up and say Cherav Bhuti, for instance. That's no existing sub-dialect. It'll be understood. It just sound funny. You can say Kerav Buki, you can say Cherav Buchi, or Kerav Bhuti. Means I work. But you're going to find Bhuti, Buchi, and Buki, all of them listed on Romlex with no explanation of why these three words are slightly different.
So if some organization or an institution or a client were interested in having a translation into Romani done, what would you as a Romani translator ask of them in order to be able to be more precise with how you would interpret or translate?
Well, who is this aimed at?
That would be right.
That would be number one question. Who is your potential readership? Now, if this is something to be sent to the European Union to be widely distributed in Europe, I would definitely suggest a Vlach dialect. For instance, European Roma Rights has a section to the latter part of their magazine in Romani, and they have reports in Romani. In fact, I don't know if they're still doing this, but they were providing oral tapes of Romani. Now they have their dialect based on Lovari. Now, if you speak Calderash, you can more or less understand almost anything in Lovari, except you'll get the odd word you won't understand. It'll be different from Calderash. And there is a slight difference in the pronunciation. So Ian Hancock constantly advises people who are learning Romani to learn a Vlach dialect, preferably Calderash. Now the reason for this is that it's the most widely spoken dialect with the greatest number of speakers with the greatest geographical distribution. You can go ahead and learn Czech Roma if you want, but it'll be only of use in the Czech Republic or with the refugees who have come from the Czech Republic. It won't be much help if you go to Latin America. Now, the Roma in the Americas, I'm not talking about the Romani Chels and Spanish Romanis who came here during the colonial period. I'm talking about Vlach Roma from the Balkans and Central Europe, have been coming to America from the last 2 decades of the 19th century. One of the earliest records of Roma in Canada is in 1909 in Peterborough. Now, at that time, they had been roughly 10 years in Canada. Now, this same group of Vlach Roma, many of them descended from former slaves in Romania who were emancipated in 1864, spread all over Europe and finally to the Americas. And they now exist from Canada all the way down through the United States, Mexico, Central America, and South America, all speaking mutually intelligible dialects of Calderash. Now you have other groups too. Lovari are coming in, and different groups. Also, what I refer to as Horachai Rom. These are like Turkish, so-called Turkish Roma or Muslim Roma. These speak a differing dialect. Now you have also Kosovari. I was told that in St. Louis, Missouri, there's a colony of about 60,000 Kosovari, according to Ian Hancock. We have Kosovari right here in Hamilton. There's Kosovari in Toronto. I know of some in Ottawa. There's also Polish Roma, what you call Polska Roma. Now, they're not Calderash. There are Calderash in Poland, but the Polska Roma are a different group, and they have a differing dialect, which I'm not that familiar with, but I have worked with the refugees, and we can understand each other to a point.
Do you think that the demand for translation is going to grow?
It depends on what is the future of Roma in Canada. If Bill C-31 succeeds, then the flow will probably be reduced to a trickle, and there probably won't be that much translation needed for lawyers and for the Immigration and Refugee Board. I mean, that would be interpreting. As far as translation, I think that's going to increase. Roma are being more and more recognized as a minority. European Roma organizations are demanding that Romani language be considered a language in Europe, that it be taught in the schools, and that documents be made available in the Romani language that are being printed in other European languages. Now, if this comes to pass, then there definitely will be a need for written translation of Romani, and in Europe, verbal interpretation. In the Americas, well, stick to Canada. What will happen in Canada is not clear. A lot of the dialects here may die out as the children end up in the school system, and because the communities are scattered and not ghettoized like they are in Europe, they may disappear. The tendency in the past has been for Roma children to often lose the language. Now, we're even seeing signs of this with Canadian Calvarash. That people are telling me their children don't speak it or don't speak it well. But I mean, this was a complaint of their grandfathers, and the language is still being spoken. And now the other thing is, as Ian Hancock has realized in the United States, the influx of newcomers speaking Black Romani dialects intermarrying with Black Roma who are fourth, fifth generation born in Canada is resulting in preservation of the language. Because if you're, say, a Canadian Romani man and you marry a woman from one of these immigrant groups, she may not speak very good English, so all you have to fall back on is your Romani dialect. So it's hard to say. There's also the leveling effect of different dialects through CDs in the Romanes, YouTube videos, communication over the internet, now even films coming out that are using a lot of Romani. So it may or it may not die out in Canada. I don't expect Vlach, the Calderash, to die out for a while. But I'm already meeting Czech Roma where their parents do speak Czech Romani, but the children who were born in Canada don't. So it's quite possible, since I do know a lot of adult Roma in Canada whose parents were not the Vlach Roma. Their parents came from Slovakia or Hungary or Romania or somewhere, and they don't speak Romani at all. Their parents did, or their grandparents. So it would depend on immigration. If enough Roma come here, and Roma churches tend to help, believe it or not, preserve Roma, because the pastors read from the Bible in Romanes. So, and a lot of Roma have these religious texts in Romani, written by people like Matteo Maximo, Stevo Demeter, Ruth Modro, who wasn't Roma, but she was married to one. And he must have helped her to get it right, because I don't see any mistakes in it when I read it. But again, will these churches continue? They do have the idea in Toronto of making a universal Romani church, where there will be one church where it will have a basement that can be used as a hall for things like weddings, christenings. Something like this, a community center in a church, would very likely help preserve the language. But you see, you have to realize that Romani is an identity marker. See, immigrants who come here from most countries don't really see a need. The Greeks are pretty good at preserving Greek in the Greek communities, so are Italians to a point. But other minorities like Polish, Ukrainians, it might last one generation and then it disappears.
Can you tell us about the most difficult translation assignment that you've ever had to do?
I think one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult, was this last one I did for Roma Community Center. We have a program in conjunction with the anti-hate crimes unit of the Toronto Metropolitan Police, and they published a document which they wanted translated into various minority languages for Toronto. The program is called Hate Can Kill, which we translate as Inato Sharmudarel or Vogtsumo Sharmudareltu. And this I found the most difficult because there was a huge number of words and expressions that just don't exist in Romani, for which I had to use incoining or neologisms. And I did manage to do it after a couple of other translators threw in the towel. It's doable, but it was really a challenge.
And what about the most enjoyable
Most
translation?
enjoyable was probably the one I did for Concordia University. It was dealing in many areas, but it had a lot to do with culture and music and the Holocaust and things that a lot of it I was already familiar with and had the terminology.
Was was some of the terminology new for translation studies when talking about translation and interpreting?
Yeah, well, a lot of what I had to come up with for both of these translations plus others will now be in my addenda for the bidirectional version of my dictionary, which hopefully is supposed to come out later this year.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And last, I'm wondering if you could tell us one of your favorite Romani expressions and how that would translate literally and figuratively.
Romani is a very idiomatic language, and often when there's no word, the Roma will use either a proverb, a saying, or something like this. Now, the one that's been hacked to death appeared in Jan Ewers, but never properly transcribed. It's always somehow misspelled or the gender's wrong somewhere. But actually it runs something like Yekabulasa Nashti Beshespe Doni Grastendi. With one rear end, you can't ride on two horses. It means you can't do multiple things at once. It should actually be Dograstendi, not Donegrastendi. And one of my favorites is Jaltaro Jeju Shainenichi. It translates roughly as, the train is leaving, but I'm not on it. In other words, I'm being left behind by events. It can be used in that way as an idiom. Or basically, see, the old people had a lot of these things, but especially in rhetorical Romany. Rhetorical Romany is, as you probably know, Roma boast themselves on their ability as orators, because Roma was an unwritten language, so there was no way of expressing yourself in the literary format, so you were more or less left with the oratory and the paramicia and the folk tales, and in the divaneria, in the discussions. So there was a special form of Romany that developed, a very flowery form, that I refer to as rhetorical Romany. And Professor Ian Hancock knows of its existence and has agreed that that's a good word for it. So has Professor Thomas Acton, a Professor Emeritus now, but former Professor of Romany Studies at Greenwich University. And this was virtually unknown until I presented it as far back as the 60s in an article for the British Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society. But I have many favorite expressions in Romany, but that's probably one of them, Jaltaro Jeju Shainenichi.
Thank you, and thank you very much for spending this time with us, Mr.
You're quite
Ronlin.
welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.